Hi, everyone. Welcome to Genealogy Adventures. I'm Brian Sheffy.
And I'm Danya Williams. We have a great show today, guys. Oh, great
We
show.
have an awesome show for you guys today. So, we are going to be speaking to, well, not speaking to, speaking with Jason Church, who's here to join us to talk about the humble structures that many of our ancestors would have been familiar with, if not lived in. Things like slave cabins, sharecropper cabins, those kind of really humble type of buildings, which in their own way really did build this country. Little intro. Jason Church is the Chief of Technical Services at the NCPTT. That's the net part of the National Park Service. Church coordinates and works to further develop the center's National Cemetery Training Initiative and related research. Before joining the NCPTT, he was a conservator and historical metals expert for the city of Savannah, Georgia, in terms of their Department of Cemeteries. He earned his MFA in Historic Preservation from Savannah College of Art and Design and a BS in Building Science from Appalachian State University. And currently, he is a professional associate at the American Institute for Conservation. Welcome to the show, Jason.
Hello.
Love
How are
it.
you
Love it.
today?
Very well. How are you doing?
I am fine.
Well, thanks
So
for
how
having
long?
me on here.
Mhm. Would you like to tell the audience a little bit about what the NCPTT actually does?
Yeah, so we're the National Center for Preservation Technology and Training. We're a National Park Service office. We're located in Natchitoches, Louisiana, on the campus of Northwestern State University of Louisiana. And we are a training and technology center of the Park Service that only looks at cultural materials. So in our day-to-day for myself in the Technical Services Division, we do a lot of mortar analysis, paint analysis. People will send us, pieces of a building, and we'll figure out what the mystery coating on it is. We also do a lot of original research. We do a lot of sort of kind of like consumer reports type of research where we'll look at commercially available maybe coatings or painting systems and see how those will affect historic materials over time. So
Okay.
that's the main thing we do.
And I don't want to blow up anybody's inbox, but if there's I suppose, a culturally important building in someone's community that they want to save, would your organization or your department be a department for someone to reach out to find out how to preserve old buildings?
Yes, I mean we could definitely, we're not going to come out and help you figure out the best way or grants or anything like that, but we can definitely put you in touch with the people in your area that will help you. So we do a lot of that. I get dozens of emails a day of that very thing. And my specialty is historic cemeteries, so I get a lot of requests that way. And that's more one where we actually do help people figure out the best way to clean, the best way to document, who in their area might be funding sources, that sort of thing.
And kind of what's the kind of breadth of I because I'm assuming they may not all be properties, but the kind of projects that you guys work with.
It is anything and everything. I might talk one day to a national park about a very large structure. We may talk to an archaeological site about. I'll give you an example of my team. So I have 6 that work for me. So for example, my team last week, I had one team member at Carville, Louisiana, using ground penetrating radar to try to find the original patient cemetery. I had 2 of my team members out at Magnolia Plantation doing laser scanning of the landscape for documentation. I have one doing research right now in the laboratory on how fire suppressants that are dropped from aerial, from planes, how does that affect cultural materials? So if there's a historic property involved in a wildfire and it gets hit, how does that affect the historic masonry or wood? And I have one team member who is doing research right now on the best ways to remove inland crude oil from historic materials in case there's a pipeline burst. And then, I've got one out doing editing interviews that she has done with former tenant farmers. So a wide range of stuff. So we work with someone who might have, a cemetery of 1,000, burials versus I might get someone who is interested in a single grave that's on the back of their farm property. What can they do with it? How can they preserve it?
Mhm.
So we get a wide range of requests.
So you deal with cemeteries as well?
We do a lot of cemetery work. Yes, ma'am.
Wow.
Cool. So as I said, I was struggling to find the right term because I just imagine the kind of projects are just so varied. Um, One of the things I was wondering is before technology, what were some of the traditional ways that things like slave cabins and sharecropper cabins were preserved?
Well, they weren't. um,
Yeah.
Photography, and that's kind of been it. And a lot of the structures that we're documenting definitely aren't being preserved. We've definitely, we are documenting ones on a very wide range. Ones that are owned by the Park Service, ones that are owned by state parks, all the way down to, getting calls saying, well, on the back of my grandparents' land, we think we have one. Can you come and look at it? And definitely some of them are being preserved. Of course, ones that are owned by, the state or by the Park Service, that sort of thing. But a lot of the ones that we're documenting, the owners don't really have the means to preserve them. Most of these aren't near a road. They're far back. We're having to take, four-wheelers or hike to get to them. So they're not, there's really no impetus to preserve them. I mean, there's no water, there's no power to them. There never was. So how do you justify dropping, $30,000-$60,000 in a, 800 square foot structure that's, a mile from the road? So
Right.
most of this documentation will be their only record.
We already have one question that I wanted to get out there because it's under the same scope that Brian is asking. Is there a website showing who to contact for individual states, or do you just lead to the National Park Service and that's the best way to do that?
Well, it depends on what you're talking about. If you're talking about just preservation in general, then yes. The easiest is to look for your state historic preservation office, and you can just put in, Ohio State Historic Preservation Office in Google. That'll come up, and that's really your front line in your own state. If you're looking at, anything there, if you've got archaeology on your site, if you've got historic property, historic cemeteries, that's going to be the best person to help you as sort of your first line defense. And that's who you're looking for, is your state historic preservation office.
Okay.
Because again, when we were in the virtual green room, one of the things you said was the enemies to these structures was the weather.
Sure.
Yeah.
These are very fragile structures. And I'll get into more when we talk about sort of why they exist and why we got interested in them. But a lot of these, of course, are in the Deep South. That the system of tenant farming lasted longer here than anywhere else. So these structures stayed occupied for much longer than anywhere else. That's why they've survived. It's not through any sort of preservation efforts for the most part, or a conscientious to keep them. It's because they were still being used. They were still housing. So the reason, and then of course in the Deep South we have hurricanes, tornadoes, flood events. On the most part, worse than most of the other parts of the country. So yeah, these are very fragile structures because of that. We lost quite a few of them recently during Ida. One of the sites that I think we're going to look at during this Laurel Valley, a very important site, they lost 9 of their historic structures, in one afternoon.
Dang. I mean, that was gonna be my question to you was what even made you get involved? Like what made you want to do this? What was your guiding? What was that?
Well, to be honest, and I don't mind saying this, I actually had no idea about tenant farming. I didn't even, I knew it existed in Depression era. It's something you think about in a Steinway novel, not a Steinbeck. Sorry, you don't think about it having survived so long. And I grew up in the mountains of North Carolina, in the Appalachian Mountains, And there we have a lot of small mill houses. My own family, that's where a lot of them live. And when I had moved down here to Louisiana, I saw these very small vernacular structures along the river road, and I assumed they were something similar, something like what I grew up with cotton mill houses. And I just was in love with them. I thought they were just so quaint, and these very small structures. And I was seeing them disappear very rapidly. Every time I went down, almost there was another one missing. And getting into technology, we got into laser scanning. I thought, well, these are the perfect things to scan. They're very easy. They're very small. These would be a great way to learn laser scanning. And we had bought a laser scanner. What a great way to learn by doing these small structures. And it wasn't until I met a gentleman, Elvin Shields, and we have several interviews with him on our YouTube channel, that he explained what tenant farming was to me and what these buildings meant. And then that was it. That's when I wanted to know more about the story. And then I went and gave a lecture. We do a lot with Grambling State University. We're not terribly far from them. And I went to give a lecture on Founders Week at Grambling, assuming that I was sort of mostly going to tell more about the technology and, sort of the bells and whistles of what we're doing, thinking that, of course, the students would know all about tenant farming. This was their history, to find out that they didn't. And this was new. I had about 70 students show up to my lecture. I had a 30-minute lecture and an hour of questions afterwards. And then another half hour at lunch, of all these students gather around going, hey, I was in this lecture. Tell them what you told me. And I realized that I wasn't the only one that didn't know this story, that it wasn't widely known. And I assume I wasn't taught it in school, but other people were. But I found out that wasn't the case. So then that became the real push for this project, was to try to get that story out there.
Because really, I mean, as I said at the top of the show, in their own way, the people who lived in these really humble structures and led really humble lives, they contributed to the American kind of capitalism that happened.
It's so sad that I mean, I'm kind of like holding back a slight tear or two because it's just really sad that you went to an HBCU and they did not know, and what this was. And it's like, I mean, we know why, because states are mandated to teach a certain history and all that and everything. But you have HBCUs, amongst other schools, have African American courses, so, and African American history courses. So why would something like that not have been taught in one of their courses? So it's,
Well, I think one of the big things that's been such an eye opener for me was the time frames. I knew tenant farming existed. Of course, we know slavery existed. We know sort of, but the time frames are off. The time frames don't match up with what I was taught in school, and I think most of us were taught in school. Because we're interviewing tenant farmers now. They're still alive, because we were tenant farming, until the latest that we have found. I interviewed one gentleman who, when he was a kid, and of course he was very young, but his family was still hand picking cotton on a sharecropping system in 1978. I was around in 1978.
right.
You don't realize the time frame that we're talking about, and that's one of the reasons that these buildings have survived. A lot of the buildings that we're documenting were still in use in the late 1960s, and it really was mechanization that replaced the tenant farmer. It wasn't anything else. It was, well, now it's cheap enough for me to buy this tractor. I don't need you guys. You're not really needed. I've bought these tractors, so it's time to leave. And a lot of the people we've interviewed have talked about, basically the landowner, the plantation owner, walking up and saying, don't really need you guys. You have till Wednesday to pack up whatever you can and leave. And this might be Monday. And that was it. So you were now homeless, you had no job, you had nowhere to go. And there was sort of a big migration in the South in that time period into towns. And, people started picking up work wherever they could, but, everyone sort of had to walk off of the plantation at that point. And at that point, most of these structures were demolished. Just no one's going to live in them. You don't need them. That's another quarter acre of cotton every time. You can get rid of these. You can have more sugar, more cotton, whatever. So that's where most of them went. So one good example is here where I live in Natchitoches Parish, so along what we call the Cane River region. Elvin Shields, who I mentioned earlier, he's done a lot of research, and he estimates there are about 800 of these structures along the Cane River in Natchitoches. And
Mhm.
now there's about 2 dozen left, with almost a dozen of those being owned by the National Park Service. So you're looking at less than a dozen in private hands.
See, I think it's crazy that people were sharecropping when I was in junior high school.
I mean, yeah, I was 6. He said 78. I was 6.
Yeah.
So,
That is
yeah.
crazy. But before we start going into the individual examples of the work that you're doing, I did get a question from Twitter, and the person who was asking the question wanted to know if taxpayer money was being used in this preservation and conservation work.
Sure, absolutely. I mean, we're the National Park Service, so yes, tax money is going toward this. This is a national park project. Um,
And because we're talking Park Service, federal government, there are things called stakeholders, people who can either indirectly or directly derive a benefit from this. What is the I guess what is the return on the investment for the American people in terms of conserving and preserving these buildings?
well, and really, this documentation for a lot of the structures, unfortunately, and I wish this wasn't the case, but for a lot of these structures, this will be the only record that exists soon. We've definitely documented structures that are already gone since we started. And we did a short pilot project in the summer of 2019 where we did 8 buildings. Last year, and I say last year, our fiscal year, so that's October to September for us. So from October to September, we documented 122 buildings last year. And now we're in a new year for us, so we're back, the clock's back to zero. We're trying to we've done several. I can't tell you off the top of my head how many we finished already this year, um, but we've had several. I mentioned Hurricane Ida. Several of the structures that we documented are gone already. We documented one building on a Tuesday that collapsed on its own on that Thursday. We've documented a couple of structures who were demolished right after we were able to say, yes, we have full documentation, we're good. The bulldozers were waiting in the parking lot for us. So this will be the only record of that. And the reality in the digital world that we want to portray is, we have sort of a false sense of how many of these structures really existed. So if you think about a lot of the tours that you've taken, let's say you go to one of the plantation, that's open to the public, they usually have maybe one or two sort of represent examples of a slave cabin, and they're usually pulled up pretty close to the main houses, and they tell the story, and that's fairly recent. So I think that's a good thing. I think kids coming up now will kind of scratch their head and say, well, of course they talk about slavery, whereas when we were growing up, that would have not been there at all. Maybe a lot of these structures they've rebuilt, or they bought them from other places and brought them there because they demolished theirs because that wasn't part of the interpretation, but now it is, and that's great. And that's really people like Joe McGill bringing awareness and getting people to talk about it has really helped save a lot of these buildings. But the reality is that one cute little building right behind the big house is false. There were probably 20 or 30 in a neighborhood on the back 40. There might have
Wow.
been one right behind the house for the cook or interior servants, but for the most part, these were whole neighborhoods way in the back, and there were lots of them. You know,
Wow.
when really we think about it, you start looking at the records of some of these plantations, and they had, maybe 100 slaves, 200 slaves. They didn't live in the one cute little cabin right behind the house. There would have been whole neighborhoods of these. And those themselves, the quarters, were active environments. These were neighborhoods where people, they loved and they lived and they had families, and they had gardens and fences, and they were very different than what we see now. So that's one of the things that we're trying to do with this digitally, is to be able to recreate some of these sites as they would have looked, and through descriptions. So one of the great projects that we're working on, if you've not read any of the books by Ernest Gaines, I highly recommend any of his books. But Ernest Gaines grew up at River Lake Plantation in what's now New Roads, Louisiana. And all of his books are fictional books set on the plantation where he grew up. His family were tenant farmers there. And now that neighborhood is gone. But we know what it was like through his descriptions. And we know from little drawings that he did on napkins and things like that, where the houses were and how many there were. And one of those was saved by LSU and moved to Magnolia Mound in Baton Rouge. So it's been preserved. So we've done a full model of that. One of our end goals is to digitally rebuild this neighborhood that he talks about in all of his novels.
My God.
So we can sort of get a more holistic view as to what, these quarters would have really looked like.
Well, what you just said really reminds me of the research that I'm doing and a number of people are doing with the Butler Plantation on Butler Island in Georgia. Because again, there are maps and documentation of the different settlements that he had. He had like something like 5 or 6. There was even a retirement settlement for mostly the really old, overworked women. I guess they didn't really want to see them, so they just parked them on this remote island that had its own settlement, and that was just kind of for them. Now, I know that Donnia's got a lot of the videos and the pictures you're going to talk about. I guess as she's getting those queued up, I'm really curious.
Ready.
You're ready.
I'm ready.
I've only ever been in 2 slave cabins. One was a reproduction at Monticello, and the other one was an original one at Patrick Henry's Red Hill. And even though one was original and one wasn't, they were deeply just profound emotional experiences for me. The emotions just ran the gamut. I'm just really curious, what was the impact? What's the impact for you actually stepping inside of a slave cabin?
There's a wide range. We've documented ones that have been turned into stores and restaurants and things like that. But the ones that have stayed very authentic, there's definitely a presence in them. I mean, there's definitely a feel to them. I don't know. I guess we've been in, probably close to 200 last year alone, because we don't document every one that we've gone to. And like I said, some of them have been turned into an unrecognizable structure. We've been in one that was turned into a bar for a pool house. I mean, but some of them that have been left alone, there's definitely I don't know. I won't call out any names on my team, and I don't want to embarrass anyone, but one of my team members, the first time she went in one to document it, just totally broke down. And it was just so much for her, and so I think everyone experiences them differently, but there's definitely a presence to be felt in them for sure.
I know that right now I'm very emotional. Wasn't expecting it. This is totally unexpected. Just listening to what you're talking about and what you're saying, and then the questions. So I am emotional about it, and I'm I guess I've been in them in the museums, but the feeling that I have right now with you just speaking on it is nowhere near what I felt when in a museum. And I know that I would definitely get a feeling because my ancestors haunt me every day. So I know I would get something from it. Before we go into your videos, Randy Simmons asked another question, which she's just been hot today. Does the Park Service use metal detectors to go over the grounds? The earth must be full of relics of people's lives. With that being said, before you answer, have you ever found someone's stuff as well?
Oh yes.
Mm,
Um, so I'm gonna bring up three things before I'll let us go to the video. The first is we don't. Um, and I get that question all the time. Are you documenting the ruins of, or are you doing archaeology? We're not. It's just outside the scope of this project. I would love. The reality is, if someone rained money down on us, we would hire 20 people and we would triple our work. Right now, there's 3 people in the field and me, and that's the entire project. When we get a little extra money, we can bring in, interns or small projects. But there's not a lot of funding. So we would love to do the archaeology. That would be amazing, but we don't. And unless we could really do it properly, we definitely don't metal detect or do anything like that. So the answer is no. And then Danya, your question: do we find stuff all the time? And we take pictures of it. We leave it. We don't even move anything. The laser scanning that
mm,
we do is non-contact. So other than setting the tripod down and when we walk, that's really the only impact we have on the buildings, which is good because some of them can't take much more than that. We've for safety reasons, I won't tell you how fragile some of the buildings are because you don't want to know. But yes, we found all kinds of things. We definitely see the drip lines around a lot of buildings. So that's where the water's coming down, sort of that edge around. There's always amazing things in the drip lines. And we've seen all kinds of stuff where the water has just eroded that line around the roof line. Um, and usually we take pictures of it. One of my favorite is a site, and I will assume whoever had lived there last, and we know the site was used until the 50s, 60s, but whoever lived there last was obviously a seamstress. All the door handles and all the drawer pulls, everything in the house were thread spools.
mm.
And on one of the drip lines, we were standing there because you have some time to sort of do nothing while the scanner's running. We noticed one of the drip lines that was really eroded. There were buttons. There was a thimble. There was just so it's like, wow, this person obviously. I mean, we've got the empty wooden spools everywhere. We've got buttons all outside. You start trying to think like, what was this like? Obviously, this person was doing more than their own sewing. Maybe they were doing sewing for the whole quarters. Who knows? Um, it was given to me by a site. I usually I don't take anything from the sites, but this I was told I had to take. The person told me the ancestors had sent it to me, and I needed to keep it with me. But it's a straightening iron, a straightening comb. So it's a metal comb that's just mangled, but it's this really, really heavy brass
Mm.
comb that was at one of the sites that was along the roadway in front of the site. So yeah, we find lots of things. But back to Brian's question, I just want to throw this out. The most emotional I've ever been in one of the structures was one that was used much, much later, but still no power, no water. That we were on, and it's way in the back of a sugar plantation. And I don't know if you're familiar with the music group, the Ohio Players.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Oh
Okay,
yeah.
I love the Ohio Players. So this house was split. Originally, it was 4 houses in one, so a quadplex. So originally, 4 families would have lived in this one. And of course, as it's been modified, doorways have been cut. Now you have one family with just 4 bedrooms or 4 rooms in this structure. And obviously, this had been maybe a girl's room, but they had painted on the walls these records. And so the Ohio Players and lyrics were all painted down the wall. And you realize, think about this is the 70s.
That wasn't long ago.
That wasn't long ago.
Mhm.
Yeah. Jesus.
So, the family living in this, working this sugar plantation, she's listening to the Ohio Players. I mean, this girl's loving, and I'll assume because it was a lavender paint, we're going to assume it was a girl. It may not have been, but, and you realize, how long this building was in use. So that one got
Jesus.
me because you realize, like, at that point we're putting people on the moon. We're, and
Mm.
we're on the back of this property with no interior plumbing, listening to Ohio Players on a turntable. So
Wow.
I'm like really bothered right now that and you made it even worse. Well, not worse, but you put an even stronger emphasis on it because you actually just said we were putting people on the moon at this time, because we were,
yeah,
and this was still happening. This was going on, and oh my God. So okay,
sorry.
let's go into the Magnolia Plantation. I'm
Okay,
gonna add that to the screen, and why don't you talk to us about it?
sure.
Um,
So this is one of the things that we're doing.
I'm going back outside just to so people can see it.
All right.
So the level of detail is just incredible.
So this one. All right. So we're documenting the properties in a variety of ways, and this is with a 360 camera. So this is a camera that takes a 360-degree view, and we use a software to stitch all these pictures together. So there's lots and lots of pictures we're taking, and they get stitched together in the software. And that way you can interact with it and you can move through it. So this is one of the brick slave cabins at Magnolia Plantation, which is now part of the National Park Service. And this is one of, I think there's, oh gosh, I should know this, and I apologize. I think there's 9 or 10 left. There were a lot more, and a tornado went right through the middle of the quarters and destroyed a good chunk of them early on. These are 1840s, and these are sort of the interpretation signs. And if you click on any of the dots that are over some of the photographs in it, the Park Service has done a really great job, an amazing amount of research to figure out who lived in these. And that's a really important thing that I think gets looked over. And I think Cane River Creole National Park has done a really great job of trying to sort of do the research to figure out who was in these. So this one, the Vercher family was living in. John Vercher was the last, and they were living in there, I want to say about the 1970s is when they moved out. When I came to Natchitoches for the first time, they were having a reunion there. My first weekend ever in Natchitoches. So that was a big thing for me, was to see. So if you kind of scroll back toward any of those little blue dots, like the one there in the little corner above the picture frame, if you click on any of those, you can see the pictures that are in them, a little bit about them. So that's an actual photograph from that actual cabin.
Oh, wow.
So these are the people who live there. And some of them we know their names, so their names are in the descriptions. And I think that's really important because I think, we're documenting the tangible, but it's the intangible that gets overlooked. So here's John Vercher and his family, and actually someone's written his name on it. It's how we know who he was. And there's of course still family around that are related, and that's a lot of the people that we're trying to talk to get sort of these stories and what it was like growing up in these structures. One of the ones that I know you're going to show our YouTube account later, but you can listen to us talking to Elvin Shields, who grew up in the cabin he's sitting on the front porch of, and talks about what it was like growing up. Actually, the one he grew up in is gone. It's the one his sister lived in and was married in and raised kids in, that we're on. So this cabin, brick, 1845, somewhere around there. And originally this was 2 families. So this is a duplex. And this is it. This is the entire thing. Nothing's missing. They haven't torn off the kitchen. This is the entire house that you're seeing right now. And the way it's, sort of the way they're interpreting it is as it was used as a tenant structure. And during tenant farming, the doorways were put in and they were split. So you've got a bedroom on one side, the other side you're using as your kitchen. But during slavery times, this was 2 full houses. So you and the whole family, you're living in that one room. Your kitchen's in that room, your living room's in that room, your bedroom's in that room. That's it. I was with a group from Tuskegee out at this site, and one of the young ladies pulled me aside and said, "My closet in Atlanta is bigger than this." And you go, "Yeah, this is about 10 by 10." And so you've got, anywhere from 6 to 8 to 10 people living in that space. And really, at that point, the exterior becomes as important. That's why yards were so important. That becomes part of your living space.
Well, taking a look at what Donnie is clicking on, I mean, it looks as though you guys have done an amazing job adding humanity into the project. Like I said, just the little things like the photographs and just knowing some of the names of the people that actually lived there. I mean, that's incredible.
And that's really, we're just coming in to document. This particular one was completely done by the National Park Service. And, they've done a really great job doing that research. And that's one of the things we would like to do on more of them. A lot of the ones that we've documented, we know nothing about them. The people who own the land don't know anything. And then you start talking to people and they go, "Oh, I know who used to live there." So it's like, "Oh, wait, if you do, tell us more about that." Because we would like eventually, as many as we can, what can we find out about the people who live there? Because that's really important.
Wow, I think I lost my thing. Oh God. Okay, let me go back.
And again, I wouldn't even know how much information local historical societies or genealogical societies would even have about these kind of buildings.
Usually not many. We're actually being contacted by the people who are directly related. So one of the things that we didn't talk about, how are we finding these properties? How are we being, so each of those spots is where we took an image. So that tells you how many pictures that we have to stitch back together. So, one of the things that, we started with this project was I wrongly assumed that we could just call people up and say, "Hey, are there slave or tenant cabins in your area? Can I get permission?" And we got a lot of, "I have no ideas." A lot of people said, I don't know if there are. Well, I don't even know where they would be. And we get a lot of people that tell us, "Well, there can't be many left. The whole U.S., there can't be but a few." So we decided to really let people sort of lead us. So we just started posting on Facebook and Instagram what we were doing. And hey, if you know of a site, call us up or email us. Drop us an email. Tell us if you know of one. And right now, that's where they've all come from. We're not knocking on doors asking to document. We're letting the houses come to us. And so that way we also sort of avoid that issue of, "Well, I'm sorry, you can't come, I don't want to talk about this," or "We don't want you on our property." That's sort of negated because they asked us. So that also, it makes it easier on us. But we realized really quickly there's more of these than we can ever. I mean, we could run this project with 20 people for 10 years and still find places. Every time I go somewhere, I think, all right, well, I think we've gotten them all. And someone will stop me and go, "Well, have you documented the ones over here?" And, "No, I've never heard of that place. Hold on, let me write it down." And we start all over again. So there's a lot more of these buildings standing than I think we ever conceived that there were. But yeah, I mean, it literally, we're running this crowdsourced. So, if go check out our Instagram and see what we're doing. And if there's of one around and you have permission, or you know who would have permission, drop us a text, drop us an email, and that's how we're what we usually do is try to build them up. So we get a good amount in one area, then we go there. So in February we're going to Georgia, and we've got quite a few lined up just on the coast of Georgia alone, enough for the month. And then my team will drive back, sort of recoup, and then we're heading to Low Country, South Carolina. The Beaufort and St. Helena Island area. We're doing some work for the Penn Center. We're going to document the buildings of the Penn Center, and we'll be doing tours like you just saw for the Reconstruction Era National Park, the Tabernacle Baptist Church, the Brick Baptist Church, some of those buildings as well.
So let me ask you a really because yeah, I'm very emotional over here. This is like really blowing me. And I don't know if you guys were paying attention, but when I was clicking on different things, the front one before I closed the screen, these pictures, I want you guys to know, if you couldn't read what I was reading, these pictures are as early as 1904. That's how early those pictures are, because that's what it says in the thing. But these buildings were built in 1845.
Mm-hmm.
So this was a generation of families living in this place. So this, I'm talking about going back to Moses. You know, our grandparents, our great great grandparents, they were living there, and they brought up their children, who brought up their children, who brought up their children, and they were all right there. Like I can say grandparents because my grandmother and grandfather were born in 1894 and 1898. So this was could have been somewhere they could have been living. And that, I think that's why I'm having a little more trouble than I thought I was going to have, because I'm picturing my grandmother. I was able to go visit my great grandmother's house, and it was sitting on rocks. That was the foundation. The rocks itself was sitting in every corner, and that's where they lived. So now looking at this, it's making me see that. And then I guess it's also making me want to ask you, can I ask you personally to go and document where my grandmother lived before that house falls?
Sure.
Yeah, we're going to
Yeah.
talk, cuz
And when people ask, what we do is say, send me where it is, and that you have permission, or who, put us in touch with who does have permission for the land. And then, what do you know about it? Do you have pictures of her?
I
Do you
do. I
have,
do.
because we want to
Oh,
incorporate all that into it. And then what we try to do is, when we're going to be in that area. So, like, I've got people who've asked me to go to Virginia. We probably won't make it even this year. It'll probably have to be next year, because we're getting so many that are being brought to us, way more than we ever thought. I'll be honest. Um, so yeah, so like originally we're doing some work for the Park Service in the Low Country of South Carolina. We're just getting you know request after request, and now it's like, okay, now it's going to be at least a month there just to hit what we've got, and we'll probably have to eventually go back as well, because so many of these places are coming up. But um,
Well, again, let's chat after the show, because I know it's the federal government and there's do's and don'ts in terms of funding, but I just wish there was a way that we could do like a GoFundMe thing for the project, because we
yeah.
have that kind of audience. They would, they're really enthusiastic, and they would love to support something like that. But I
Yeah.
appreciate it. It's the federal government, and
well,
there are all
we
kinds.
we have a friends group, and we also work through our local university, so we can get paid that way. And some of these, and we, sometimes people, we're sort of getting funded from a variety of ways. So some places pay us to come, places that have the money and have large, endowments, or we're maybe documenting 20 buildings on site. Some have just offered, like Evergreen Plantation, for example, privately owned. They have 22 cabins. We couldn't miss that. So they let us stay there. So that offset made it very inexpensive for us to document their 22 because we got to stay there for free. So that helps us. Travel money is always something we're running out of. But yeah, I mean, some places can afford to pay, most can't, and we want to document them all. So we take the money from one and sort of that helps us fund, your grandmother's back on the back property kind of thing. So
Well, let's get into the video really quickly. The shotgun tenant farm. It's like a minute long. So guys,
yeah,
listen there.
and this is, of course, this is not a slave cabin. This was built about the turn of the century. And this one is no longer standing. This was at Laurel Valley in Thibodaux, Louisiana, and this site was hit very hard by Hurricane Ida, and they lost 8 of these structures, including this one. So this doesn't exist any longer. So what you're seeing is we are using a 3D laser scanner. Where we have more than one. We're using, in this one, a Faro Focus S, and it throws out a grid of laser light that is making points of all the spots that it's seeing. And from that we can actually take measurements. We can make blueprints and measure drawings and things like that from our scan. So this is the real building as it exists. This isn't photography. This isn't a drone. This is actually a point cloud of laser. And from this, we do the exterior and the interior of the structure.
And I can appreciate how fragile these buildings are because looking at this video, it's not like they had an interior wall and an exterior wall. It was like the wood, and that was it.
There's no insulation in any of these. Those barge boards on the outside are the same ones that you see on the inside. And there's the thickness of that wall. That's one board, so about 3/4 of an inch. Yeah, we collapsed a couple of porches trying to document these because they're so fragile.
This is like absolutely amazing. I'm looking at this and all I see is like, I'm sorry. I'm very very emotional right now cuz all I see is when we went to go visit my great grandmother's house, and it Jesus, it was amazing to be able to see it. And the barn is still standing to the back, and I think the outhouse is also, everything is still standing, but I think the barn is standing because it's full of hay. I think
Mm-hmm.
that's the only reason that that it's standing up. So yeah, I don't, please don't close out when we,
Okay.
don't, because if my mom is watching this right now, like, I know she's going to be like, you need to talk to him and find out, because to be able to document her place like that bef- you know before anything happens, because the people that own that land, they haven't done anything to it. We were able to go up there and look at it. And I took my mom to see it. I took my aunt to see it, and then my cousin and I went to see it, and it was just it's an amazing sight. But now to see what you're doing with, and we never even tried to go inside or anything like that. It wasn't even a thought. So I don't even know if you can.
And
Like,
we wear hard hats and everything, and luckily all the structures have been okay so far. We've got one coming up that I've sort of joked with my team. We're going to put a rope around our scanner so we can yank it out if the building goes. That we're going to do it. We do it remotely, so um, we're operating this thing from away so that we're not in the scan. But part of it is also so we don't have to stay in the house either.
Jesus, I'm just like amazed. So,
Oh, I'd like to
um,
talk to. Please email me the ones in Siler City. We're heading to North Carolina later this year. I know where Siler City is. I don't know any about these, so that'd be really awesome.
oh, well, there you
And
go.
Yeah.
and if I
Um,
remember correctly, Donia, you're familiar with at least a few in Edgefield.
Okay, so yeah, let me ask you about this because right on Highway 25, you can drive, and then all of a sudden you'll see like out of your peripheral vision a flash, and you don't know what that flash is, but it's a flash. And then you happen to look to the side and you realize that it's the top of the roofs, the metal roofs, and
mhm.
the sun is shining on it, and that's why you're seeing it in the peripheral. Now it's just on Highway 25, but it's so overdrawn, it's so covered with wooded areas. Would you be able to go into some places like that?
So vegetation is hard. Um, we and this is one of the reasons. It's funny. People say, "Well, can't you just drive down the road and find them?" The reality is no. They could be right there, and you drive past them 1,000 times and never see them, and they're 10 feet off the road because of vegetation.
Mm-hmm.
Um, the laser scan does not like vegetation for a couple of reasons. One, leaves move the whole time, so it just comes out a blur to us most of the time because everything's got to be still for that beam to hit and bounce back. So there's a couple of things we can do. We'll wait till the winter when the vegetation has died off. A lot of times we'll ask if someone's asked us to come scan, we'll say, well, can you do your best job to remove as much of the vegetation as possible? Uh, you know, in the safety realm of keeping the building up, because sometimes that kudzu actually is holding the building up. We have found that out.
Mm-hmm.
Sometimes those vines are the only thing keeping the building. We documented one where we started removing and realized, the vines coming in one way and coming in the other were actually what was holding it upright. So as we started, the building started going with it. So it was like, oh, the vines have to stay. We
I
got,
swear, I think that's what's holding up my grandma. I swear, I
yeah.
believe that. I think that my grandmother's house is still standing. My great grandmother's house is still standing because of that. Now, mind you guys, my great grandmother died in 1956. We are in 2021. I first saw it in 2017. The house, the barn, the outhouse, it all is still standing. So, before anything else, is there a contact for you that because I got people talking about please post his contact information and an actual website just for you guys, not necessarily your YouTube channel or something?
My email is the best. I can put it in the chat and you guys can share it. Um, the project itself doesn't have its own site yet. We
Okay.
are working on that. All of these will eventually go on a National Park Service story map where every location will be.
Excellent. And thank you for doing that. And while you're typing that in, a question from Myra. Do you have a counterpart in Missouri and specifically the St. Louis County area?
Nope, it's just us. Um, yeah.
He said, "Yeah, it's just that."
It's just us. It's myself and a team of three that basically live in our government van, and they just drive around with all the equipment. I line everything up. I do talks like this. I get all the permissions. I line everything up, build a big spreadsheet, and occasionally I'm lucky enough to join them. But for the most part, they're doing all the work in the field. Um, so if you um, if you go to our YouTube, I mean our Instagram, let's see, I think let me check, make sure I'm not giving you the wrong, but you can see the team in action. They post while they're in the field, um, continuously. Yeah, it's so on Instagram it is.
Yeah, I mean, this is just such an amazing thing. Whew. I did not realize I was going to be this emotional, but I really think it's because of my grandmother, my great grandmother, and where she lived in South Carolina. It was in Edgefield, South Carolina. Um, I think she has everything to do with it. Lula, she don't play games. So she comes to me when necessary, and I guess she was like, "Get my house done." I don't know. But if we can get her house done, I would love that. I would love
Well, we're
that. And
hoping to be in South Carolina in March. Um, so maybe you could do one of these live from the site, and you could interview my team instead of me out out in the on the property and see how it works.
Jesus, oh, that would be so awesome.
And again, our perspective is always going to be different because we can think of 100 ancestors that we can actually name who would have lived in one of those buildings. And I will always cycle back, and I was really surprised that I had such a strong reaction in the slave cabin in Monticello because that was reproduction. It was never lived in by enslaved people. Um, but there was the Brian who went into that cabin because I was with my siblings and we were chatting and having a whole conversation. And I think I barely said a sentence after I walked out of that building. It just impacted me on that kind of a level. And I was really surprised, really, really surprised by that. So at least when I came time to go to Patrick Henry's farm in Virginia and go into his actually authentic slave cabin, it was still jarring, but I didn't have the intensity of that first one because I could see the people in there. I could see the lives being lived, and yeah, it was rough. It was rough, but they survived. But my takeaway was they survived it because otherwise I wouldn't be here if they
Sure.
didn't.
Yeah. Well, I want to thank you like so much for being here, and I wasn't expecting to be as emotional as I am. So yeah, y'all, I'm sappy when I need to be. But please, once we hang up and everything, don't disconnect, because I do want to talk to you about that. And I hope you guys like really took a lot from this show. I know I did. I'm talking to the fans now. Um, Randy said, Danya and you and Brian always emanate powerful emotions during your shows. You're being so moved, it moves us. You being so moved, it moved us. So I don't, this one right here just kind of took me, I wasn't ready. So,
Well, I'm going to
thank you.
say this was very powerful. Thank you again, Jason, so much for coming on the show. Next week for me is going to be equally powerful and for me really emotional because we're going to be talking about ancestors who were sold downriver using U.S. slave ship manifests and records in your research. Um, so again, another rough topic, but genealogically speaking for us, it's important, and again, we hope that people are going to have a good takeaway. So as always, that is going to be next Sunday right here, 4 p.m. Eastern Standard Time.
Yep. I'm sorry. I'm so done right now.
Well, like I said, it's and some people have been sharing their comments with us. It is hard, especially for Black genealogists, because we can name ancestors who would have lived in these type of buildings, whether they were enslaved or whether they were sharecroppers or tenant farmers.
Yeah.
And we hear those stories.
Yeah. Yeah. Okay. Well, again, thank you guys for joining us. We look forward to seeing you next week, and we hope that you enjoy the rest of your Sunday. I'm Danya.
I'm Brian. You have an enjoyable rest of your day.
All right. See you
Thanks for
guys.
having me.
Yes. Thank you again, Jason. Thank you again. Bye.